I want to thank you all for being here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Tonight's presenter is Christopher Dant, a local novelist and photographer who previously worked with the great landscape photographer Ansel Adams in Carmel, California. Dant's work has been part of several juried exhibits in California, where he taught photography for the Friends of Photography workshops that Ansel began in the 1970s. His black and white landscape photographs have also been in exhibits at the Southern Vermont Arts Center. At GMALL, Christopher recently has given writing workshops and presentations about Ansel Adams, the great photographers in history, and about the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. And tonight we are happy to have him return to present this fascinating history of the iconic photographers from America's Great Depression of the 1930s. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you all. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes.
Everybody's muted.
Thumbs up.
That's a good one. All right, let's get started. Let me share the screen. Hopefully you can see that wonderful image. As a photographer, I have always been fascinated at how photographs have the great power to engage and influence people, influence wars and ideas and laws through a public outreach. And as Gloria mentioned last year here, I presented Matthew Brady, who preserved for all time in photographs our collective imagery of the Great Civil War, which changed our perceptions of that war greatly. But unquestionably, the most remarkable history photographic record of life in America occurred during the 1930s and early 1940s, when a selected group of photographers documented America's most uncertain and tumultuous times, that of the Great Depression. What they created 90 years ago remains today the largest and most treasured documentary photography project ever undertaken in US history. And their images have become icons of an era, images that have been and still are the subject of major art exhibits all over the world, and which inspired books and lessons of history and an award-winning novel and a motion picture, and even songs by the great Woody Guthrie. But most of all, they were images that moved a nation into action. So tonight, I'll introduce you to some of these photographers and show you some of the terrific photographs that tell the stories of a people who faced great adversity in their lives. It's a story of us, a story of America. And tonight, in our trials of today, a stark reminder of how America came through a very difficult time through shared sacrifice. But first, let me give you a bit of a background of how this all came to be, some of which you will know. A century ago, during the 1920s, America had grown prosperous with a surging economy. The Great Civil War, the Great War was over, and Wall Street was increasing as much as 20% per year, with wild speculations from investors. It was the Roaring 20s. Americans owned new cars, radios, telephones, and houses for the first time, a great deal of it on credit. Despite prohibition, Americans were happy. Farmers in the Plains states had bumper crops, some of the best in history, and it was a great time to live. But on October 29th in 1929, America sold and Wall Street crashed, puncturing the speculative bubble that had been building through the Roaring 20s. That day, 16 million shares were sold, a day known as Black Tuesday. Panic set in across America. Investors lost billions and hundreds of banks failed. Industrial production plunged by half, and consumer price index dropped 30%. And it led to an unemployment rate as high as 25%, which is the highest in history. America has descended into the Great Economic Depression, the worst crisis we had faced since the Civil War. But it just wasn't the investors that lost everything. Many ordinary Americans lost their earnings, their investments, their savings in banks, their jobs. Even some lost their homes and were forced to take to the road or live in shacks or tents like this one. 1 out of every 4 Americans, 34 million men, women, and children belong to a family without a full-time wage earner. Millions of men roamed the countryside searching for jobs that didn't exist. Industries died and people were broke and they had no food. Tragically, even, zoo animals were killed and their meat distributed to families. In rural America, farm prices collapsed and families were driven from their land. To this mounting catastrophe, Herbert Hoover's response was non-existent. He considered direct public relief character weakening, and the crisis only worsened. And soon, Hoovervilles, as you see on the right here, sprang up across America, named after the president America had come to blame for everything. Then, in November 1932, as the Depression deepened and the banking system was about to go under, Americans took out their anger and overwhelmingly voted Franklin D. Roosevelt to lead the nation through her crisis. FDR immediately started pushing through Congress his New Deal, public works projects, reforms, and regulations to help struggling Americans back on their feet. And as part of this New Deal, the FDR created the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, to improve living conditions in rural America for farmers and migrant workers. And to promote this, they created a publicity department to document America's poverty and the government's efforts to alleviate it. A photographic group was born from this, and it had the odd name, a historical section. FSA brought in Roy Stryker, an American economist and photographer, to lead the group. Stryker hired photographers to show in stark terms the effect of economic disaster and depression and how the FSA benefited struggling Americans. He wanted photographs he could publish in newspapers and magazines and put on posters and in books to ensure that Americans everywhere could see the embattled nation. Here we see a first of 3 of photographers on the right. That's John Vachon, Arthur Rothstein, and Russell Lee, with Stryker on the right, examining some of their newly created photographs. From 1934 to the early 1940s, Stryker would hire 12 photographers, some of them seen here. Their collective efforts produced the most iconic images of the Great Depression and of American history. And tonight I will talk to you about 6 of the most notable ones. We won't have time to do all 12. But Stryker didn't want to just churn out propaganda photos of bread lines and dirty-faced children. He wanted to capture the raw emotion behind the Depression and bring empathy to suffering of ordinary Americans. He sent his photographers out with simple instructions. I want to see their eyes. I want to see their faces. I want to see raw emotion, and I want to see people struggling in the land. His charge was to introduce Depression-era Americans to America. And in the photographs they would create, Depression-era Americans showed as much suffering as strength. Through the eyes of these photographers, we'll see their sadness, yet the beauty of their resilience. So let's meet some of them and see the remarkable photographs. Arthur Rothstein was the first photographer sent out by Roy Stryker in 1934, and for the next 5 years, he produced some of the most significant photographs ever taken of rural and small-town America. Rothstein photographed families in the Shenandoah Valley, and here is Mrs. Dobson and some of her 9 children living in a 3-room house that was later repossessed. She told the photographer, "Sir, we only just exist here." A pregnant wife and her 3 children in Arkansas, 1935. The family moved from home to home, picking cotton and vegetables. The worry and misery are etched in all their faces. The husband refused to be photographed, believing the government would hurt them. This is Jay Huffman of Grassy Butte, North Dakota, sitting idly in front of his closed store in 1936. He was forced to close the general store he had owned for 6 years because of the drought that started in 1931. But he was hopeful and waited for better times. This is a family of migratory fruit workers from Tennessee camped in a field near a fruit packing house in Winter Haven, Florida in 1937. The one daughter ominously holds up a pair of scissors the mother had used to cut her hair. Posing for these portraits gave the people just a moment of relief. and they believed their photographs would help them. Rothstein came across this son of a migrant citrus worker in Florida. He was hungry and asked Rothstein for food. He bought the boy a meal, and he gave his parents money to buy food for the family. Rothstein was very skilled in his portraits, like this one of Henrietta, the wife of a poor homesteader from Pennington County, South Dakota in 1936. She was looking to her barren fields on a hot, dry day in the plains. And this is a beautiful portrait of a farmer and his wife and their 8 children. They posed for Rothstein on the porch of their Idaho potato farm, which had just been bought up by the FSA's Resettlement Administration, saving them from eviction. The young boy on the left had proudly dressed up for the portrait, which I found very cute. Rothstein captured Mike Sulliger of Carson, North Dakota in 1936, looking to the heavens for rain. In the 1930s, 3 words were achingly familiar on a Western farmer's tongue, and it ruled their lives: if it rains. The Great Depression was not the only calamity that faced America back then. In 1929, Great Plains saw frequent rains and fertile soils and bumper crops of wheat, and the future looked bright to them despite the beginnings of the Depression. But soon it reached America's heartland, and demand for wheat dropped dramatically, and it collapsed prices and plunged all of rural America into a problem. And to keep up, farmers only plowed more land, with millions of acres under the tractor, and more wheat was produced. And in 1931, a massive crop of wheat was harvested, but there was no one to buy it, and the grain elevators overflowed, and crops were left to rot in the fields. Then, beginning in 1931 and 32, the rain stopped, and a series of droughts hit the plains, droughts that would last for 10 years. Farmers' land became dry and tractored out, as they called it. The exposed topsoil turned to dust, and without windbreaks like trees, rolling winds churned it into massive storms like this one. This is in early 1931. Prairie winds had picked up the land and blew it so great that the day turned into night. Rothstein captured this black dust storm that loomed behind a car trying to outrun it on the Texas Panhandle. Rothstein came upon this dust blizzard over Colorado in 1932. Millions of acres of farmland became useless, and hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes. The Great Plains became what was called by one journalist as the Dust Bowl, and the people all called it the Dirty 30s. This is an abandoned farm in Oklahoma in 1934 with nothing but dust on it. One day we just up and left, the man said. Nothing here anymore, nothing but this dust. We're moving west. In 1930, Oklahoma lost 20% of its population to outmigration. Men from all parts of the country, some abandoning their families, hitched rides, hopped freight cars, or even walked across the country. Rothstein said the most distressed situation he ever encountered was the Dust Bowl in the Oklahoma Panhandle. He said it was like the landscape of the moon. Boise City, Oklahoma, was the epicenter of it. About 14 miles south of Boise City in Cimarron County, Rothstein came across this man, a farmer, Art Coble, who was digging out posts for fencing from a sand drift. He told the photographer, "It's a futile exercise, but you have to try." Rothstein captured Coble's 2 young sons choking on the dust. He took several pictures and was about to leave when suddenly the wind picked up. Rothstein said, "I turned to wave goodbye to Art Coble and his 2 sons, and I saw the man bending into the wind and his boys with great swirls of sand. I raised my camera and took one photograph as they struggled to make it past their shack." The resulting photograph was rapidly and widely reprinted across the country, touching emotional chords with everyone who saw it, and soon it became the iconic picture of the Dust Bowl. It influenced Americans who had no sense of identity with this poor farmer or the Dust Bowl, and it helped pass soil conservation legislation to remedy the dire conditions. 9 years later, Rothstein actually returned to the Coble farm, and he learned that the family had made it, and they stayed. 2 years before he died, Daryl, the young boy here on the right, was asked about growing up in that time. He said, "I just thought the world was coming to an end." Today, they are all buried on the same land as you see here. On May 11th, 1934, one dust storm picked up and lasted days. Huge winds caught and carried some 350 million tons of silt all the way from the northern plains out across the country to the eastern seaboard. Dust lodged itself into the eyes and throats of weeping and coughing New Yorkers, and even ships some 300 miles off on the Atlantic saw dust collect on their decks. It even hit the White House and settled in the Oval Office on a day FDR was struggling with the problem of the Dust Bowl. FDR ran his finger across his desk and said, "This, gentlemen, is what I'm talking about." Congress passed the Soil Conservation Act that year. Those who inhaled the airborne particles suffered from dust pneumonia called the brown plague, which killed hundreds and hundreds of children. Rothstein captured these children leaving for school wearing goggles and homemade dust masks from a ranch city in Boise City, Oklahoma, right after the April 1935 dust storm that was the worst, that had blown over 1,000 miles of dirt at speeds of 100 miles an hour. Russell Lee came to known for his excellent photographs of Pennsylvania miners, which got him hired by Stryker in 1936. Lee's FSA photographs are known today, particularly those pointing out the whitewashing of America. This is a Saturday night at a Minnesota saloon. Lee documented the seedy life of loggers, prostitutes, and bootleggers of the region. And this photograph became quite famous. It was picked up by a network for the opening of Cheers TV show, where troubles are all the same. You can see that on the lower right. This is a man sitting on the porch of a general store near Jeanerette, Louisiana. Although Lee and other photographers took pictures of people of color, the Great Depression's main victim, as Americans came to visualize them, were white. This contributed to the misbegotten idea that Americans struggling during the 1930s were rural and were white, but nothing could have been further from the truth. For in 1932, when a quarter of white Americans were unemployed, half of Black Americans were without work. Black workers were generally the last hired and the first fired, and Lee thought they deserved notice and took many photographs of people of color. But Roy Stryker in Washington openly worried that too much racial honesty might sink his ship at the FSA. Part of his mission was to present to Congress a sympathetic portrayal of Americans' suffering. Stryker needed to justify the New Deal legislation that was designed to alleviate what he thought white, unemployed, poor Americans. This is a poor white farmer of Southeast Missouri Farm, 1938, a beautiful portrait never published by the FSA. Stryker knew that Congress, who controlled the FSA funds, was dominated by Southern Democrats, they're called the Dixiecrats, who were interested in preserving, quote, the racial status quo. And knowing this, Stryker said, "I'm just reluctant to lead the agency in a crusade against racial disparity." Roosevelt himself feared the Southern Democrats, as without their support, his New Deal would never go through. And to tug at these Dixiecrats' heartstrings, Stryker accentuated white suffering and resisted the inclusion of Black farmers in their public relations material. But Lee ignored this. He said, "I see people's plight, their hard work, and many were not white." Unfortunately, Stryker controlled his photographic images by punching holes in the negatives that he wouldn't use, rendering them unpublishable. Many of his photographers were dismayed that he would deface valuable images of Black people. He'd given his photographers shooting scripts that said, quote, "I need you to draw their attention to the struggling of white people of America." But his images like this one weren't all Black people, and he ruined all the negatives, angering his photographers. Perhaps Stryker didn't like the composition, yet without consulting his photographers, he defaced many of the valuable negatives. It's estimated nearly half of the negatives shot during the FSA project were ruined this way, half. In 1939, the whitewashing of America came to a head when Stryker saw Lee's photograph of Mexican pecan shellers in San Antonio, Texas. And by this time, the Depression was lifting and the pressures on Stryker shifted to show Congress the results of the aid it had given to farmers, upbeat shots. But Lee continued photographing struggling workers, here mostly Mexican, and their kids working in factories and waiting on food lines. Stryker asked Lee to show life on better farms, which Stryker himself called glorification pictures. But Lee remained focused on the downtrodden, and it irritated Stryker. "I must say I can't do much glorifying out of anything you've taken here," he said to Lee. Lee then left the FSA. But before he resigned, he made several remarkable color photographs. This one of his last, of Faro and Doris Cadul, homesteaders in Pie Town, New Mexico. A vast majority of the FSA photography archives are in black and white, cementing the often bleak vision of rural America, but a small portion were taken as the Depression was lifting, and they were in color, like this one. They constitute a distinct and striking record of the country, what was emerging from a decade-long trauma. A handful were shot using the then new Kodachrome color film. I'm sure many of you remember Kodachrome, but it was expensive and was very complicated to develop, and it was difficult to capture anything moving because it was such a slow film. So there were very few portraits like this one. Carl Meidens, a Boston native, started as a newspaper reporter, but he was really more interested in photography, and he was hired by Stryker in 1935, but stayed just a year before becoming the founding photographer of Life magazine. He gained a reputation for his images of bedraggled farmers and their families in the Ozarks, in Oklahoma, and Arkansas, and Missouri, and Kansas. And here's one of them. He captured the living conditions of a farm child in her austere two-room Ozarks cabin in 1936. The walls were all covered in newspaper. There was no insulation, no plumbing, and a leaky wood stove was their only heat. And here is the same family, the girl with her mother and baby brother. There were 6 children living in the tiny cabin, and the husband had just died from pneumonia a few months earlier. Meidens captured the bleakness of their world. This is Meidens' well-known image of 2 children living in the backwoods of Virginia. Some of the children's clothes were made from feed sacks, and they often didn't wear shoes. They didn't have them. They lived in rag and paper-built houses, and they ate only lard and eggs. This is Meidens' most well-known series of photographs of this Tennessee family living in a one-room built hut on an abandoned truck chassis, an old Ford truck chassis. The father, an illiterate woodcutter, had built this one-room structure for his wife and 8 children. Meidens said, "They were living in these miserable quarters, but when I photographed them, they seemed happy and they didn't complain. They were still very hopeful." This is of the same series, the mother and father with some of their children. And the mother's skirt here is a torn, ripped flour sack, and the children's clothes were from meal containers. They had very little food, only that you could grow behind their shack. And the family's water supply was a running creek near the highway where the chassis was parked. Meidens' photographs portrayed their misery, yet the resilience, as they worked together to make it. When the photographs were shown to Stryker, he sent them to FSA officials, and not long after, a resettlement officer visited the family and got them a suitable house nearby with some land for farming. As a sociology teacher of the 1930s, Marion Post Walcott saw the reality of depression and the problems of the poor. She had been photographing for magazines, but the then famous photographer Paul Strand showed Stryker some of her remarkable portfolio, and she was immediately hired in 1938. Walcott had been an underappreciated photographer, and many of you may have heard of her, but not many people have seen her photographs. She made some of the most enduring images of poverty and depression in the rural South during her time at the FSA. This is a beautiful photograph of cotton pickers in the Mississippi Delta in 1938. Obviously, Stryker never published this. And a striking portrait of a cotton picker in Mississippi in 1940 was published later after the New Deal had gone through. One of the most remarkable and famous photographs of Walcott was this one of a coal miner's child carrying home a can of kerosene for lamps and heat in Scotts Run, West Virginia. Walcott placed her camera to give equal weight to the company houses on the right and the coal railroad cars on the left, and waited for the little girl to enter the frame in her white dress. Her contorted posture suggests that the can was very heavy. It's really a beautiful, haunting image, both in context and stark tone. It was a stern reminder of isolation and the Depression in West Virginia in the 1930s. A standout among more than 9,000 negatives Walcott contributed is this 1939 photograph, very, very famous. Jim Crow laws were strictly enforced in the 1930s South, and Walcott made this stark image of a Black man entering the outside entrance of a segregated movie theater. It's beautifully composed, the image broken by the diagonal line of the stairs and an arrow leading up to the 10-cent seats for African Americans. A white men-only door below underscores the segregation. Walcott sternly said, as an FSA photographer and documenting poverty, I was committed to changing the attitudes of people by familiarizing America with the plight of the underprivileged, especially in rural Black America. Walcott considered this one of her best images. It has been, and it continues to be published frequently and widely in articles and books about the Depression in the South. And like Russell Lee, Walcott used color film near the end of her tenure. These farmers are tilling soil in Georgia in June 1941, and just like the widely known black and white images, these color images focus on rural life and the labor of the people. But the hues brought an arrow closer to home, and they seem more hopeful than their white and black counterparts. Of all the FSA photographers Stryker employed, none are as well known as Dorothea Lange, and I'm sure you all recognize her name. She was already a successful portrait photographer in the 1920s, but her photographs of the Depression made her famous, world famous, and she was awarded a coveted retrospective of her work called Words and Pictures at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, an achievement very, very few other photographers have ever attained. In fact, Words and Pictures just were shown there 2 years ago. Her tenure at the FSA brought over 40,000 negatives. Her photographs, particularly one remarkable one I'm going to tell you a story about, are among the most famous in photographic history. In photographing the people of the era, Dorothea Lange said, "No matter how destitute the people are, you must show pride in them." At age 7, she survived polio, but was left with a bad limp and pain for the rest of her life. And she knew and empathized with the adversity she confronted. And she did that well, as you will see in her work. This 1933 image turned Lange from a studio portraitist to documentary photographer. From her window of her portrait studio in San Francisco, she saw some men standing in a bread line, which was funded by a woman called the White Angel. And she ran down to photograph it. A single figure turned towards her camera, weary with his begging tin, his hands folded almost as if he was praying, his mouth a thin line of despair. This one image convinced Stryker to hire Lange, and it is one of her most famous images. Another famous Lange photograph shows a tired migratory laborer on a hot day in the plains between dust storms. The woman's name was Nettie Featherston, and she had 3 children and all lived in shacks as they picked crops from field to field in Texas in 1935. She told Lange, "This country's a hard country. They won't help bury you here. If you die, you're dead. That's all." Lange came upon this tent of a family of 7 migratory workers from Tennessee living in a camp outside of Sacramento, California in November of 1936. The father had later told her, "Thought I could make it better out here in California, but life's hard out here too." Dorothea asked the girl if she could enter the tent. Ruby Nell Shepard, a young woman of 19, invited her inside to take her photographs, and she told Lange she had been married, but her husband had just deserted her. Lange's captivating close-in portraits of Ruby Lee revealed her profound sadness, the despair and fatigue from the constant worry and hopelessness that life brought her. She was displaced and rootless. After this series of compelling photographs were published, many searches were made for Ruby Nell Shepard to find out her fate. Ruby had survived the Depression and is seen here on the right 8 years later in 1944 in much better spirits after she was taken in by a family who discovered her. And in 1950, when she was 33, she married a loving man from the same family who took her in, and who had steady work. And they continued to live in California, in Sebastopol, in fact. She was finally happy and lived well until her death from cancer in 1970, just days before her 54th birthday. But as we will see, not all the younger generation of the Great Depression survived as well. This is a Missouri family of 5 on their way through Tracy, California, 1936. They had been living in their car and it had just broken down. Lang often would stop and talk to the people, taking notes and transcribing them into her photos. The mother told her, "We got no place to live now. We're on the road to someplace better. We're like a bunch of ants. We're scurrying for work, for food." Often, many of the migrants were embarrassed by their situation, and one young girl living in a tent with other migrants told Lang, "I never wrote back home and told people we live in a tent. I wrote that we're well and such as that, but I never wrote that we live in a tent." In 1935, Lang came across this young family hitchhiking on Highway 99 in California. The father, 24, and the mother was 17, came from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Their baby had just been born in the Imperial Valley in California, where they were working as field laborers. They were broke and hungry. Lang found this family between Dallas and Austin. She wrote, "The family with 3 children have left their home and connections in South Texas and hope to reach Arkansas for work in the cotton fields. They were penniless with no food and only 3 gallons of gas in their tank. The father's under the car trying to repair a flat tire. The father said, it's rough, it's tough. Life's tough any way you make it." And Lang made numerous notes you see here on the left about the people she photographed, often quoting them as she talked to her. Here she came across pea pickers in California. The man was saying to her, "Ma'am, I pick peas from Calipatra to Ukiah." This life is simplicity boiled down. In her famous image called "Ditch, Stalled and Stranded in San Joaquin Valley," February 1936, Lang photographed a maroon driver, stricken in his impasse as she looked up at him with her camera at the man's gaunt face. Lang often approached her subjects from below to give them some sense of dignity and not try to overpower them with her camera. Her camera was quite large. Lang said, "The man's stricken face, the immensity of his situation, his distress is just heartbreaking." Lang photographed this migratory cotton picker in Arizona in 1940 as he rested at the cotton wagon before returning to work. He had been picking cotton all day and told her that a good picker earns $2 a day, working for 10 hours in the field. She moved towards him and he brought his hands up to wipe his mouth. His hands cracked and worn. His splayed fingers covered his mouth as he spoke to her. "We want help. We need a lot of help, but we don't want to be looked down upon and called a bunch of names." This is one of Lang's best photographs. Lang photographed Alma, a rural rehabilitation mother who came to Tulare County, California, and her husband and 11 children in 1938. Lang said of her, "These are the women of the American soil. They are a hardy stock. They are the roots of our country. They inhabit our plains, our prairies. They inhabit our deserts and our mountains, our valleys and our country towns. They are not the well-advertised women of beauty and fashion, nor are they a part of the American style of living. These are women that represent a different mode of life. They are of themselves in a very great American style. They live with courage. They live with purpose." Really a beautiful quote. This is plantation overseer and his field hands on the Mississippi Delta in 1936, a widely circulated portrait featuring the black farmhands looking plaintively at the camera. The plantation owner appears to be showing off his possessions, his vehicle, the black workers behind him. And when the picture appeared in U.S. Camera Annual 1939, it carried a quote from a viewer outraged at the racial oppression. "Did you or did you not know that slavery was abolished?" it said. Obviously, Stryker never published this photograph, but it was very famous. Lang was particularly sensitive at the disturbing effect of the depression in children. This is a child and her mother at an FSA rehabilitation center in Washington in 1939. The girl had just had her one meal of the day and was feeling relaxed. Many children of this era would grow up to see better days in the wake of the New Deal and out of the prosperity of post-war America. But back then in the 1930s, many children had years of hunger and hopelessness. Lang entitled this famous photograph, Damaged Child, Shacktown, Oklahoma, 1936. The little girl with a wounded face stares defiantly at Lang. Lang wrote, her expression says, quote, "Knock me down and I'll just get back up again." Like this young girl, the children were the heartbreak of the depression, homeless, hungry, and always wanted. She photographed this little girl who had just had some beans and bread, but was still tired and weak. This is a mother and baby on a road in Tulare, California in 1939. The photograph on the left shows the mother with her baby and a dirty face. It's an image of despair. Then, moments later, the father washed the baby's face with the edge of a blanket damp with water from a canteen, and he smiled at them, and they smiled back, and she took the picture. Only moments later, Lang said, "This photo forces us to remember that people retain their humanity, and even in the midst of misery, we need to see both of these photographs and remember the father's tender gesture of washing his baby's dirty face before we can even begin to understand this young mother and her child." Lang's famous image entitled On the Road to Los Angeles, 1937. Men walking alone were called hobos or bindle stiffs. They carried everything they owned in small sacks on their shoulders or in a suitcase, and they walked from farm to farm looking for picking jobs. But it was dangerous because they could get attacked by locals, and they often did. As she drove the back roads, Dorothea Lang would see families like this one who had abandoned their homes, and she would just stop and talk to them, trying to ease their suffering. This was a couple with 4 children in Pittsburgh County, Oklahoma, who were forced to leave their farm in June of 1938. They had no car and had walked hundreds of miles across the state in blistering heat. He told her, "We got nothing here left but ourselves, ma'am." Here are 2 photographs. One on the left is pea pickers from Vermont waiting for relief checks. Their 6 weeks' earnings were $7. On the right, an ex-tenement farmer in the Imperial Valley of California showing the man's grim hardship. Photos by FSA photographers like Dorothea Lang showed that through all their suffering, Americans stood fast and clung to the hope of better times that might come on their own. But this was the paradox of what Roy Stryker saw. He had hoped the photographs would show Americans broken down by poverty, only to be restored and happy with jobs and homes by the New Deal relief checks. But instead, government officials saw undaunted courage, fierce optimism, and determined individualism, even in the face of economic ruin like this man on the right. Some Americans were just too proud to accept government help. And that sentiment is seen here in Lang's photo of a 1938 gas station pump in Kern County, California, with a stern warning that the government would take their country away. In March of 1936, Dorothea Lang was driving north on Highway 101 through San Luis Obispo County, north of Los Angeles, and she spotted a sign for pea pickers, migrant workers, campsites with tents like this one. She had already taken quite a few photographs that day of migrant workers, and she kept going. She felt she had enough. Yet something about the roadside camp that stuck in her mind for many, many miles. She turned around. At one spot, she came upon this pea picker's tent in Napomo, California. Lang was later said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I didn't ask her name or her history. She told me that she was 32 and had several hungry children. She told me that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children had killed. Freezing weather had destroyed the pea the pea crop, and the pickers were out of work, and many of them were on the brink of starvation. She had just sold her tent in order to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures somehow might help her. And so she reluctantly helped me. There was sort of an equality about it. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. To Lang, this poor mother and her children symbolized the hunger, the poverty, and hopelessness of the Depression. Her captions described a mother so desperate for food that her family had to sell the tires on their car, which later was shown to be wrong. Then Lang moved in closer to the woman and asked her to put her hand to her mouth. The children looked away. She entitled the photograph "Migrant Mother." 1936, Lang had promised the woman, whose name she did not ask for, that the photos would not be published, that they were only part of a government project. But instead, Lang sent them to the San Francisco News as well as the FSA. The newspaper described it as a woman in ragged clothing holds a baby as 2 more children huddle close, hiding their faces behind their shoulders. She squints into the distance, one hand lifted to her mouth, and anxiety etched deeply in the lines of her face. The newspaper reported that some 3,000 to 4,000 migrant workers were starving in Apoma, California. And this one image was so powerful that week, the pea picker camp received 20,000 pounds of food from the government. But by then, the woman and her children had moved on. Roy Stryker called Migrant Mother the ultimate photo of the Depression. He said, Lang never surpassed it. The woman is immortal. Migrant Mother hangs in the Library of Congress and today is the most reproduced photograph in the world. But the rest of the story has yet to be revealed. For 42 years later, in 1978, Migrant Mother's photograph took an unexpected turn. The Migrant Mother surfaced to tell her side of the story in an interview with a Modesto Bee newspaper. She told the world her name was Florence Owens Thompson, and she holds up a framed photo of her, a gift from the newspaper. Her image was also displayed on the cover of a book, In This Proud Land, published by Roy Stryker. She said she hasn't sold the tires to buy food. She said that her kids didn't really live in Apoma. They had just stopped there briefly because the car had broken down. And once the car was fixed, she and her family moved on before any of the food or any of the money came in because of her photograph. And in the interview, she revealed she wasn't white, as everyone had assumed. She was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, a non-white citizen. And it is believed that had Roy Stryker known she was Indian, he might have punched holes in this picture to render it unpublishable. Lang knew that Stryker had seen photos of Indian peoples and had openly said, you know, I just can't get too excited about the Indians. I know it's their country and all, and we took it away from them. Ah, to hell with it. Lang was so outraged at Stryker's stance, and throughout her tenure at the FSA, she endured a fractious relationship with a man who in turn was deeply uncomfortable by the strong-minded woman. In 1940, Roy Stryker fired Dorothea Lang, simply saying she was uncooperative. After this, Stryker was highly disliked by the photographic and artistic community, especially after his tenure at the FSA. And, excuse me, in the end, Migrant Mother, which became the face of the Great Depression, did not leave a legacy for Florence Thompson. The fact that the iconic photograph had been published all over the world disturbed her. She saw it in a number of magazines, and she wrote a letter to U.S. Camera Magazine saying that you could do Dorothea Lang a great favor by sending me her address, and I may inform her that should you publish my picture in any magazine again, I and my 3 daughters shall be forced to protect our rights. Florence later complained, I'm just tired of symbolizing human poverty when my living conditions have improved. The magazine did forward Thompson's letter to Lang, who felt, quote, shaken that her photograph had caused the woman grief. But in the end, it really rang hollow. For on that March day, Lang hadn't asked for the woman's name, said to her she wouldn't publish any or sell any of the pictures, and that she'd send her a copy. all requests she never honored. Perhaps Lang felt that the notion of a kind of equality between herself and Thompson was just a way of justifying the practice of photographing poor people with or without their permission. Some years later, after the interview, she posed here with her children in the same position as the original image of Migrant Mother. There's the woman kneeling to her. That's the baby that Florence Thompson had held. And in the end, Migrant Mother did help Florence Thompson. In 1983, she was hospitalized, but unfortunately later died, and her family appealed for help with the medical bills and funeral to set up a fund. Her son, Troy Owen, said that the family received more than 2,000 letters and thousands of dollars in donations to the Migrant Mother Fund. After her death, Troy said, "For Mama and for us, the photo has always been a bit of curse. But after all those letters and all that money came in to help her, I think it gave us a sense of pride in the end." In 1983, President Ronald Reagan offered his condolences, saying, "Mrs. Thompson's passing represents the loss of an American who symbolizes strength and determination in the midst of the Great Depression." And in 1998, she was memorialized in a 32-cent postal stamp. Now you know the rest of the story. Particularly after Migrant Mother became the face of America's Great Depression, Dorothea Lange's images grew increasing attention and were published widely in magazines and newspapers and in books. Thousands of Americans were moved by the suffering she had documented. A man writing about migrant labor camps in California saw a collection of her images of migrant farm workers, and she wrote a letter to Dorothea and said, "How I wish I may do this as gallantly as you. I'm only a writer." But the writer was John Steinbeck, and her images help inspire The Grapes of Wrath, an award-winning novel. And another man who had read the novel was inspired too, and that man was John Ford, who directed the award-winning movie seen by millions of people. The novel's Joad family struggles drew attention to the plight of Depression-era Americans, and just a month after the nationwide release of this film, Congress created the Select Committee to investigate the interstate migration of destitute citizens. And ultimately, Dorothea Lange's photographs started much of that movement. As the Depression wound down to its end, a wide array of FSA photographs became public. And in 1939, Lange published her photographs in a book called An American Exodus, a record of human erosion. And then in 1941 came 12 Million Black Voices by Richard Wright, with photographs by Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and Russell Lee that depicted the poverty and misery, yet the strength of Black Americans in 1930. It was a book that seriously flew in the face of the image of white America that Roy Stryker and the FSA had been constructing. So in the end, it appears that Dorothea Lange, and as we will see, Walker Evans, would have their voices heard through their photographs. So in the same voice with Dorothea Lange, we must mention the great Walker Evans. He had already been a successful photojournalist documenting government-built resettlement communities in West Virginia, a pioneer of the documentary style of photography, which was just becoming well known by then. Evans was the very first photographer to have a one-man retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Dorothea Lange followed him. His photographs are point-of-view images that reflect his distinctive vision of America, as we'll see. Stryker hired Evans in 1935, but like Dorothea Lange, Walker really disliked Roy Stryker. And I put these two together because Stryker on the left said he had a stable of photographers that included Evans that he could trust implicitly. But there were tensions, and I think Evans posed like this to mock Stryker's portrait on the left. In 1936, Stryker sent Evans to Mississippi to document soil erosion and the present state of buildings. Evans made some images of erosion, but also the suffering people in Black quarters. As he believed, his function as an artist was to describe life as he saw it. In 1937, Evans was fired by Stryker, who said, Walker just wasn't going to cooperate, and I had to have people who would not just take pictures they wanted. And as we saw, Stryker would go on to fire the great Dorothea Lange. And that stain of Stryker and his group remains very visible today. As a case in point, Evans photographed the sharecropper's child combing her hair, and many like it. It was a beautiful photograph. And the photo, of course, was never published by Roy Stryker. This was one of the images that Evans made of sharecroppers that prompted Fortune magazine to produce an article on the conditions of sharecropper families in Alabama during the Depression. He asked for an article, and the novelist, very famous novelist at the time, James G., was brought in to write the text that accompanied Walker's photographs. The article was rejected by the editors, but later picked up as a book, and it was entitled, "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men." G. and Evans spent weeks gathering their stories among sharecropping families. The editors had asked Evans for a photographic and verbal record of the daily living environment of an average white family of tenement farmers, but Evans flouted the order and documented both Black and white farmers. Then, when the book came out in 1941, the editors left out the images of Black Americans. Nonetheless, while its initial run was modest, it eventually won high praise. And today, this book is routinely studied as a documentary of Depression-era South. This is Evans' famous photograph of Floyd and Lucille Burroughs of Hale County, Alabama, 1936. The father in this picture was chosen for the cover of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. The portrait of father and daughter, barefoot and seemingly at ease, is a beautiful example of the dignity and austere beauty that Evans discovered in the lives of ordinary farm workers. In his photographs, Evans didn't want to have a point of view or influence his subject, but he just showed them as he found them. He photographed people in their houses, on their doorways, in the streets, trying to capture them just as they were. And this Evans portrait of Lucille Burroughs, the little girl you just saw, is really elegant, and it's so simple and beautiful. Like her father, Lucille Burroughs was a strong woman and capable, and she was known to pick 150 pounds of cotton a day. From this one photograph, millions of dollars were donated to a fund to help the sharecroppers, including Lucille. And from this one image, many people wanted to later know how Lucille turned out. And I did some searching, and I found out she had gotten married when she was 15, but she was divorced and married again and had 4 children, but her second husband died young, and she was left with children to feed. She never became a teacher or a nurse, as she had once dreamed, but she was forced to pick cotton and wait tables, and she remained poor. Then, tragically, in 1971, at the age of 45, it all caught up to her, and she committed suicide. So if you look at this innocent picture of the 10-year-old to see if any of that sad story could have been foretold, to see if there wasn't a way to make it come out better for Lucille, there wasn't, tragically. And tragically, this was the fate of a lot of younger children who suffered so during the Depression. This is entitled The Haunting Eyes of Allie Mae Burroughs. It's a series of photographs Walker took of Allie Mae at her Alabama farm in 1936. The sharecropper's wife was 27, a mother of 4, when Evans photographed her. The photographs would become the iconic images of the Great Depression. At the age of 27, Allie Mae should have been in the prime of her life, but she had a very hard life, no money, and 4 children to feed, along with a wider anxiety of their condition. She aged well beyond her years. For a seminal publication called American Photographs, Evans selected this particular image showing Allie Mae as somewhat content, welcoming, and accessible, but with a psychological ambiguity of a Mona Lisa. But let us now praise famous men, Evans presented a more closed and irritated Allie Mae, the troubled victim of both the Depression and his camera's burrowing eye. This was the last image he made of her, and she was clearly irritated. It is this one portrait that was seized upon by early reviewers of the book as its quintessential image, which made Evans most famous. And Allie Mae's irritation was indeed real. In an interview after Walker's book was published, Allie Mae told him she was very unhappy that Evans had profited from her image while she was left to suffer in depression-torn Alabama. Like Lang's migrant mother, also photographed in 1936, a woman's image of poverty and unhappiness had made the photographer well-known and prosperous, while leaving them poor and in obscurity. Evans shot this 1936 image of sharecropper Bud Fields and his wife, Ivy, his mother, and 3 children in Hale County, Alabama cabin. The image captures the starkly bleak living condition of sharecroppers in the American South. Evans said of this photograph, "I suppose without meaning to, that I was trying here to photograph human poverty. I just couldn't help it. We were all in it. I was in it. Everybody was desperate. I find that it's very hard to describe what that was like, but this comes very close." Also in Hale County, Alabama, Evans posed the Tangle family, sharecroppers, a photograph that appeared also in his book. The mother, seated holding her youngest, looked suspiciously at Walker Evans, who tried to put them at ease, but he could not. Their tense faces underscores the unhappiness that surrounded the poor family as the mother grew increasingly impatient at the seemingly futile exercise. This is another well-known image from Walker, the hands of Negroes holding their pans in the lineup for food at a camp for flood refugees in Forest City, Arkansas. Then, as the Depression eased in the late 1930s and early 1940s, FSA photographers began documenting improvements in farmers' life to contribute promoting the government's efforts. The composite of this FSA photographs were published in magazines to illustrate farm life, moving from poor to better livestock, land use improvements, and better health through homegrown food. Here's a case in point: Marion Post Walcott photographing the Peacock family having dinner on their Alabama farm in 1940 after they had been helped with FSA improvements. They did not know that the picture would be published. The farmer kept telling Walcott, "We're having sausages and cabbages and carrots and rice and tomatoes and some cornbread, canned figs, bread pudding, and milk." I would like to eat that well. Dorothea Lange's photograph of this new home, believe it or not, of a rural rehabilitation client in Tulare County, California, was well known. The husband was 26 years old and off working in the field, and the wife, 22, is shown here with her 3 small children. The family had just bought 20 acres of unimproved land with a first payment of $50 and then received an FSA loan of $700 for stock and equipment. Now they had a well-built one-room house, 7 cows, 3 sows, and homemade pumping plant, along with improved permanent pasture. He said to Lange, "Ma'am, piece by piece, our place just gets put together." As the FSA program of the Great Depression came to an end, thousands of photographs appeared widely in popular magazines, newspapers, posters, and in books across the United States, making it impossible for any American to deny the effects of the Great Depression. Without the committed work of these talented photographers and the government, people living on the East Coast would have remained oblivious to the suffering of their fellow Americans struggling on a Kansas farm, or suffering in the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma and Texas, struggling in the Jim Crow South, and enduring the long migration to California. FSA Photography Archive was assembled under Roy Stryker, and his photographer remains today the largest documentary photography project of a people ever taken in U.S. history. FSA photographers would amass 77,000 different prints from 164,000 negatives that today consist of 250,000 prints at the Library of Congress. And because the photographers were funded by the government, the photographs remain in the public domain. And at the Library of Congress, you can go to this website. They've all been digitized, and you can download any of them, even in high resolution. And I did that for all of my photographs here. You can see in my presentation. It's a great site to visit. In the end, Stryker's photography program faced charges that it was only propaganda for the New Deal. Even a few called it a socialist program. But as the photographs were published to America, those Americans who were removed from them, away from rural America, found a rapport with the faces they saw. The images gave them a stark and clear reminder of the daily lives of Southern sharecroppers, of Dust Bowl farms, of Western migrant workers, and in families everywhere just trying to scrape by. And they wanted the government to help. And they lobbied them heavily to push through the New Deal. And in the end, what Roy Stryker collected helped passed the legislation, but more importantly, it became a historical reminder of America's desperate peoples trapped in horrible circumstances. I think Dorothea Lange said it best when she said, "Great images make me feel and care about the people that I photograph." And in her images and all those FSA photographers, we clearly see America's people and their plight, their sadness surrounding their daily lives. And despite Lange's words that accompanied many of her pictures, these images, we don't need words to feel what they felt and experienced. Their faces are an indelible reminder of America's proud people that faced the last ditch in their lives. As World War II began, America came through the Great Depression and her land was eventually restored, but these photographs remained, and through them, we stay connected to her people and we continue to care about them and we think about them. We really are part of the American family because we really do care about them. And when we find ourselves now wringing our hands at our current woes, and there are many of them, we can always set in proud relief the experiences of our parents and our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and came out a lot stronger, as these photographs continually remind us. They really are today a collective work of art, regarded as a national treasure for the United States. Thank you. And I'll take any questions.
What was the website you said you got those photos off of?
Go to the Library of Congress, and there, in their type FSA photographers or FSA photographs, and you'll find a separate website that shows what I showed. You'll find it very easily. Just type in the Library of Congress and Farm Security Administration FSA photographs. And you'll find you can type in the box, like I would type in Dorothea Lange and I would get like 75,000 hits. Wow. And I could go to any one of them and download. I could download a very high resolution TIFF image even. And a lot of them were in my presentation. Yeah, there are a lot of other universities. Yale University and the New York Library also has many of these digitized on their website. They're everywhere. They're in the public domain. Beautiful photographs.
Okay, we have a question from Neil. He asks if there was a similar program to photograph urban poverty during the Depression.
Well, yeah, the FSA obviously focused on, rural America and the plight of the farmers and migrant workers. There wasn't a separate photography project for that, but a lot of the photographers, and I didn't show a lot of them, did photograph people in the cities, lined up in bread lines, sitting out in the streets. There are some beautiful images, actually, of bread lines going into places that are run by Al Capone in Chicago. And yeah, there are those photographs, but and they were taken by FSA, but most of the images that were used to pass the New Deal are the ones that I showed, the kinds of images in rural America. And it very extensive when you look at where it was. It was all over the South. In the Midwest and as I showed in California extensively, where Dorothea Lange photographed.
A question from Althea. She said she missed the first part of the talk, but were all the photographers working for the FSA and not the WPA? Well, the FSA, first of all, the Congress created what they call the historical section. It was a documentary effort by the FSA, and no, there were no photographers that I know of that were hired by the Works Project Administration, and they were hired by the Farm Security Administration. That was Roy Stryker's group. Now, did photographs were they taken of working people and WPA efforts? Possibly, but I don't know that. And Andrew says, great presentation. It made him feel happy to be so lucky to be alive now rather than then. You too?
Yeah, yes. As I said at the end, when we start wringing our hands at our current woes, we only have these photographs to remind us how bad life was back then. And we have a lot of problems today, and and they're being documented in photography. And certainly the crisis that we've had for the last 2 years, 2.5 years with the pandemic and the economic depression that we've had, nothing like the Great Depression. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people see these photographs and they just shrug their shoulders, and it's sort of like, it's so removed. It's 90 years ago. I mean, I can't identify with these people, but I look at them and I'm very moved by the people. I feel an identity with them. I just cannot imagine some of these people and these children of how horrible their lives were. I mean, it really, really moved America to a great deal. And I wasn't able to show a lot of that. And some of the photographers we didn't talk about, but yeah, it's moving, and it does make us feel very lucky to be alive today.
Anyone else?
No other questions? You know all about the FSA and Roy Stryker, the most hated man of America. I'm just kidding. He was very disliked after what he did, but he did amass those photographs, and we're very thankful for that.
Let's see, there's a question about one of the photographs, the color photo taken by Marion Wolcott of a Black family hoeing. It looks like they are wearing their Sunday best. Could the photo have been posed?
I don't know that. I don't think it was posed. I don't think they asked him to put on different clothes. I don't know. I'll have to maybe find out, but yeah, it looked very colorful and almost hopeful, and almost like they weren't poor. But I'm 99% certain she just came upon them and photographed them, and that's the way they looked. And they may have worn that. I'm sure the clothes weren't new, but they may have worn some very colorful photograph clothes. I don't think that they were posed at all. None of these images were posed. The only one that I might say was known to be posed somewhat was the image that Rothstein took of the man bending into the wind, the famous picture of the Dust Bowl. I think he had asked the boys to kind of lean forward, and the man to lean forward. There was a lot of wind, but he did apparently ask them to lean further forward to make it look like there was a big storm. And there was a storm, but that was the story. There's a lot of stories about these photographs, and some of them are very inaccurate, especially about migrant mother, which is written everyone. I mean, if you type into Google migrant mother Dorothea Lange, you will find hundreds of websites discussing this. And I tried to tell what the truth was, and I got that from a lot of newspaper articles and books, which I think are accurate.
James Comley just made a comment that these were the ones who were the ones that survived. I guess the people in your photograph, in those photographs. Well,
they survived up until that point, yeah. But I don't know if any of you watched. I just watched with Maureen the other night the Grapes of Wrath. It's just horrendous. Yeah, I mean, a lot of them just starved in their homes. They died of starvation. If they didn't die of dust pneumonia or illness, and they had no doctors, it was horrible. It was horrible. Yeah. So these are the ones that she came upon and survived. I mean, that one family hitchhiking across Highway 99 in California, the young mother of 17 with a baby, and they had no food. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So, like Lucille Burrows, who committed suicide, a lot of them didn't make it, and a lot of them just couldn't handle it anymore. It was just too difficult.
We have a question from Daniel. Did any of the subjects of the photos receive any money from books published with their photos taken?
No, let me put it this way. I don't know for 100% certainty, but the photos were government owned, and so they were in the government owned. They were part of a later part of the Library of Congress, and they were owned by the FSA. And so when they got published in the books, Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and others did make money from the books. So in a sense, the photographs in them did help publish the book. But there wasn't any photographs that were sold and the money given to the people. And as I mentioned with Allie Mae Burroughs and with Florence Owens Thompson, who was the migrant mother, this irritated them, saying these photographers were making money on these photographs in books. In other words, they didn't take pictures of the migrant mother and then sell them to people. Now, I understand that now there are some images of the migrant mother that are being sold, and I don't understand how that's possible, because they're all part of the public domain. But none of the people in these photographs made a cent from any of these photographs. They only agreed to do the photographs because they thought somehow, and I don't think they'd get money, but somehow it would give them some recognition. People would see them and maybe help them. And that was true. In the Pea Pickers camp in Napomo, California, they got 20,000 pounds of food from that one image. Millions of dollars were donated to sharecroppers in Alabama from the picture of Lucille Burroughs. And others like it. People donated money, but nobody in the photographs were given money from made money from the photographs. No. It's too bad, because they could have made some money.
Let's see. Were there any Black photographers?
Yes.
Who worked for the FSA?
Yeah,
Gordon Parks?
Yeah, Gordon Parks. And I didn't talk about him, and I won't go into why. He produced a couple of very, very interesting photographs. One that of a woman, a Black woman that worked in the government, and he posed her with a broom and I think a mop, almost like the American Gothic image. And I just found it very contrived, and I don't like it. He did some good photographs, and he was hired later by Stryker. I don't know how they got on, and I don't know how he felt about the whitewashing of America. I'm sure he was not pleased. He came in later as a photographer, but he and several others I didn't discuss. I only picked the ones that I thought had images that were so well known and had moved so many people and produced books and images that were actually caused America to really move and make some changes. So yeah, Gordon Parks is well known. He I think later got involved in the movie Shaft or something. He was a musician, as I remember. But again, yeah, he was one of the Black photographers, the only Black photographer.
Okay, thank you. Lucy says, the power of art to change society, the New Deal, farm management. What will come from the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, if you're suggesting what will the photographs, the images of the pandemic bring, of course, the pandemic is unlike the Great Depression in that it's everywhere. Okay, so the photographs of that we saw, mostly of rural America, reached the people like in New York that had no idea that this was going on, or they knew it was going on, but they really didn't have any sense of how powerful this was. So, I mean, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about how photographs of the pandemic, and there are many, many of them all over the world, will influence and move people. I think the government and what has happened with the pandemic, which is remarkable, with the initiation of vaccines and all the things that have happened, I don't think the photographs necessarily did that. If I might be so bold to say that what I do find a difference is the attitudes of Americans now versus the attitudes of Americans in the 1930s really disgusts me with some of the people and what they're doing and what they're saying about, social distancing and masking and taking vaccines and trying to get over this thing. And back in 1930s, people, they were doing anything. I did mention a lot of the farmers just didn't want to accept the government's help. They said, I don't want to take your money, which I found crazy because they were suffering. So they could have gotten New Deal relief checks. But the attitude of the people was really a lot different. And I find that a stark difference. But I have seen some pretty harrowing images of the pandemic when it first started, like in Italy and in other places where it was really bad. And it's horrible. And it's so stark and in color and close up. I mean, a lot of these were pretty stark, but yeah, I don't know, I suppose that would be a good talk. how photographs would change how influence people. It's very, very different because there were so many of them. Nobody hired them. And I don't think any photographs have really made any major change in the way the pandemic and the way that regulators helped the countries through the pandemic.
Skipping from the pandemic, though, the George Floyd trial would never have come about if there hadn't been the video that young woman taken.
Exactly
the
right.
January 6th raid on the Capitol might still be thought of as just a bunch of people, exercising their rights to complain a little bit. And the pictures sort of put a
damper on that one. Yeah.
Right.
No. I mean, images of the power to greatly move, and they're indefutable evidence, right? Especially video. So, yeah. But I mean, it's remarkable in the 30s that we have these beautiful, I mean, I say they're beautiful because they were beautifully composed and especially Dorothea Lange, but horrible in what they depicted. I find a great deal of, they really are a magnet to me. I love looking at them. And if you go to the Library of Congress, and anybody who can't find that website, let Gloria know, and Gloria, you'll send me your email and I'll send you the link to the website. It's a great website. I've spent hours on it just typing in different things and finding really fascinating photographs I'd never seen before. There are thousands and thousands of them. And I tried to pick the ones who were not only famous, but that moved me personally.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, but I'm going to go to Steve Sinding, who's got his hand up. Steve, unmute.
Thanks, Gloria. And thanks very much for that presentation. It was really fascinating and beautiful. My question has to do with why the project had to be undertaken and why the government sponsored it. I mean, part of the arts programs during the Great Depression were efforts on the part of the government to support artists,
right?
Whether it was playwrights or musicians or poets or visual artists. And so was this really a program principally to support photographers? Or, as you mentioned, was this a public relations effort to support the New Deal programs that were aimed at overcoming the effects of the Great Depression? And I asked the question because today one couldn't imagine a program like this. In large part because the press is so omnipresent with its cameras and both still and video, that you wouldn't have needed something. You wouldn't need something like this to document what's going on. Right. So that's kind of what's behind my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually exactly true. I mean, it was a very different time. We didn't have press photographers, and this has nothing to do with art. As part of the New Deal, Roosevelt created FSA, and and part of that, the main thing was to improve the conditions in rural America for farmers and migrant workers. And I don't know who, it was Roy Tugwell, or not Roy, but somebody named Tugwell, who was in charge of that. And he said, we need Congress to create a publicity department in order to document the poverty in America and also document the government's efforts to alleviate it. And so that's why the photography group was born. Back then, not photography was new, but not everybody had cameras. And, the smaller cameras like the Leica and the Connex, which these photographers somehow used, and Dorothea Lange still used the large Greiflick cameras. So they were, a lot of people didn't take pictures, but it was starting to come into its own. But they wanted to hire professionals who would document this and go out on the road and find, images of people suffering and, broken and in poverty. And Stryker later said, okay, now we got to start showing pictures of the improved farmland. We got to show farmers, being able to feed their families, being able to, to rebuild their farms, and making it. And of course, that was a very difficult thing to document, because it didn't happen very, very easily. And as I mentioned at the end, a lot of the people were just stubborn, and they said, it's bad, but I'm going to stick it out, and it is what it is, and it'll get better. And a lot of people just, were very stubborn that way. I'm not taking your money. I'm not going to improve this. It'll get better. And so Stryker had, in the end, he had enough photographs that I think did influence Congress. However, I don't think the photographs were actually the only thing that pushed through the New Deal. There were a lot of other forces. But these photographs were a big part of it. And they were all over the country by the mid to late 30s. As I mentioned, spurned books and movies. But it was all really a publicity department, the document. And they wanted documentary. They wanted documentary photographers like Walker Evans, who was well known at the time as a documentary photographer, and Dorothea Lange, to go out. And he gave them shooting scripts. He gave them, I want you to photograph this week the farms of Boise City, Oklahoma, and show the Dust Bowl, and show the effects of the Dust Bowl on them, and the effects on the livestock. And I want to see dead cows, and I want to see people suffering. And the biggest issue and that I uncovered was the whitewashing of America. There was several very, very famous articles written about it in the Atlantic and the New York Times and others that talked about the racial disparity. And that was a big one back then.
Joanna asked the question, did any Black people get any government help? She knows that the SS program did not include the Black people because the Southern Democrats would not support it otherwise.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Blacks did, but it was a lot slower and a lot weaker than for white Americans. And that was a tragic problem of the time, the Jim Crow South particularly. But yes, I mean, the Black farmers who were trying to make it on their farms, they did get money to start doing new types of farm, plowing and improvements in their land, and go in government farm camps and try to improve everything. And Black farmers did get help, yes, but it was certainly a lot more white farmers and white migrant workers that were helped.
Okay. And Joanna had this comment: we seem to have no notion of sacrifice ever since George W. Bush said after 9/11 that America should go shopping, as if that is all we can imagine.
Yeah. Well, that's a big subject.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's shared sacrifice. People pulled together they had themselves, and that was all they had. And yeah, I mean, people weren't complaining saying, I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that. I mean, today people are just big whiners, and it makes me angry because back then, there was a real spine in America, and I mean, there is today, but I mean, there's a lot of whining people, and I really found it very inspiring to see these people and how they tried to make it, and some of their images. I mean, that family in Tennessee that lived in a one-room shack built on a chassis, they were smiling, saying, we're going to make it. We've got water, we've got some food, and they never complained. I mean, I'm sure they did complain, but it was very inspiring to see that.
Okay, and the last question will be from Althea, and she has attended 3 of your excellent photography talks, and she wonders if you are working on another interesting slideshow and talk for us.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll have to now. Photographs of the pandemic. I don't think I want to go there. But no, I mean, when you think about the three big things in the United States, in the world, the Great Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II, there's a lot to be said of the photographs of World War II, but there wasn't a program like this one that sent photographers out to document it. There were thousands of photographs and photographers that took pictures, especially Frank Capra, who was very famous and captured some amazing images of World War II. And that could be maybe a very interesting history of photography. But yeah, I mean, when you look at like what Ken Burns produces, and I hugely admire him. The Dust Bowl. He never did one of the Great Depression, but he did some wonderful documentaries and photographers, and he never did one like this, which I found interesting. He could make a great series on the photographers of the Great Depression, but perhaps of the Second World War. And I find it interesting that we're talking about coming out, back then, coming out of the Great Depression, out of economic uncertainty, out of a very difficult time. And then what it really got America out of it was World War II. And what are we looking at today? Well, not in war, but there's a war going on in Ukraine, and we're coming out of a horrible pandemic, and I hope that we're coming out of it. And it reminded me of that. It's tough, but it was a lot tougher back then, a lot.
Well, that's something for you to think about, a future program. So I want to thank you, Chris. This was really, really very interesting and moving.
Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed doing it. It was a great honor to do this.